So welcome to SDS Thursday, brought to you by SDS Seminars. We are a UK-based company and specializing in training for mental health professionals. And we've been in business, in this training business, for over 30 years, since 1990. Paul, the founder of our company, Paul, say hello. I think lots of people know you. Yes. And Paul founded the company in 1990, but he's obviously been working as a clinical psychologist well before that. So I don't want you to dwell on the idea how old is he, but
from the age of 15, folks, from the age of 15.
Yes, he was a very early bloomer, like Sheldon Cooper. Right. Okay, so today we are running SDS Thursdays. I hope you've already been to some of our Thursdays, but if you're here for the first time, welcome. Welcome to everyone, to those who are first time and not first time. And I will ask you, if you're here for the first time, can you write in the chat box, how did you discover SDS Thursdays? Whether you've seen an advert in one of the magazines, professional magazines, or emails, or whether it was word of mouth, how did you discover us? It would be fantastic to know. If you just received an email from us, it's very likely that you were already on our mailing list. If you remember what magazine you saw us in, like Therapy Today, I just saw somebody commented, that would be really useful for us to know. And as always, I will ask you to write a few words about yourself for our benefit and for your colleagues in the room. Just always interesting to know that somebody's on the train from Edinburgh, but somebody is in Edinburgh, for example, right now, and what kind of setting you're working in. Are you working with adults, or are you working with children or adolescents? What kind of modality you are working in? Anything that might be useful for your colleagues to know and for us to know. Everything will be very much appreciated. Today's topic is quite an unusual topic. We usually talk about clinical cases, but today's topic was suggested by Paul because he's been thinking about it for quite a while. And I kid you not, as maybe it was selective attention, but as soon as Paul suggested this topic to me, and I put it on the list for SDS Thursday, trigger warnings, the amount of publications in various media about trigger warnings just skyrocketed. And I don't know whether I just started noticing them because of my selective attention, because I knew we will be doing this Thursday, or maybe suddenly we reached some sort of threshold and suddenly people decided to speak out on this topic. So we'll try to discuss it. I'm sure Paul will refer to some of the news publications of the last few weeks. While we're still gathering, and it always takes a few minutes, I will just remind you how to find our website, and we'll let you know about some events which are coming your way. And we've just listed a couple of brand new courses today on our website, so you will be the first to know. And of course, you know that when you book well in advance, you get the best discount with SDS Seminars. So that's something for you to know. Let me just share my screen with you and tell you about these exciting things. So you probably all are well familiar with SDS website. It's skillsdevelopment.co.uk, and I will put a QR code on the screen for those who watch us in the as a recording on YouTube. But it's easy to find us on Google. Just look for SDS Seminars or Paul Grantham Psychologist, and you will find our website straight away. So we are currently in the process of delivering a 3-part working with narcissism course. If you've missed it, it will be available as a recording after a little while, maybe a week or 2, and you will be able to purchase it and watch it as a recording. But we've listed a few additional courses, and I wanted to share those with you as well. So in June, we are running our ever so popular Essential Supervision Skills 2-day course. It will be running live on Zoom. So anybody with interest in supervision with a supervisor's hat on, please consider booking it. It's one of our most popular courses. And another very popular course is CBT Introductory course, 3-day, very intensive introduction course, probably one of the best introductory courses on CBT in this country. I don't want to say in the world because I haven't compared the whole world, but definitely know that in this country it is extremely, very, very highly rated. And then the new course, which I wanted to share with you, will be running in October, and that's working with empty nest syndrome. Again, just like with narcissism, not very much is done about this topic clinically. So this will be a course which will be 3-parter, like the narcissism. It will run once a week for 3 weeks from 9 to 12. So you have your afternoon available for you to do your clinical work or admin work, anything you need to do that afternoon. I think these days will be Fridays, if I remember correctly. And so you can just finish early on Friday if you want to do that. And at the moment, because we've only listed the course today, it is sold with a 50% discount. It won't last long. Only the first 15 people can book with a 50% discount. So if you might be interested in this topic with Paul in October, please book quickly and enjoy a 50% discount for this 9 CPD hours course. Okay, so now I think we've got, I'll be able to close the room in a few moments, and I'll be very happy to pass the microphone to Paul to take you on today's discussion. Paul, please.
Thanks very much, Julia, and welcome, folks. Let me just share my screen. Great. Julia was saying about the timing of this and how this sort of seems to have very recently come into consciousness. I'm not fully aware either about the reasons for this, although I'm going to be making reference to it. A review article came out reviewing the research in this particular area a few months ago, so that may have had something to do with it, because the particular review article is, to my knowledge, the only one that has been conducted on this particular topic, and but the article's actually grabbed a lot of attention and a lot of comment. So the question is should trigger warnings be abolished, and why? And not surprisingly, before we actually start off on this, I really think it's appropriate I should give a trigger warning regarding this, because this presentation may contain material that participants may find distressing or disturbing. So let's just give a context to this. You're probably familiar with it anyway, but just to update you on it. And I think as well, I'm not sure if people are necessarily aware of how comprehensive and ubiquitous trigger warnings now are. So I just thought it was worth just running through these. They exist in magazines, in newspapers, websites, blogs, chat rooms, social media. They are also now quite prevalent in the education field in relation to teaching material. That's both in schools and in universities, on films, TV programs, radio programs, and can I hasten to add, because I was actually in the pub the other evening and had this experience myself, in conversations as well. So they are pretty ubiquitous. What exactly are they? By the way, can I just say, folks, I'm going to run through the presentation side of this fairly rapidly, even though personally, I think that there's easily a number of days of discussion that's actually around this, and there's a lot of issues around each of the different things that I'm going to be highlighting. But basically, what I want to do is to not spend too much time on the presentation, in order to hopefully to give some time for you to come forward with your thoughts and comments and opinions on this. Although, as Julia will no doubt remind me, I'm not always very good at being brief on these things, but I'm going to try my best this evening, folks. So what are trigger warnings? They're content warnings, typically regarding things that are going to be read or seen or heard, which are intended to help individuals prepare for or avoid content. So obviously the implication of this is that the content is in some way, shape or form unpleasant. So a very brief history of this, and I think the history is important because the concept has developed over what is basically a 25 to 30 year period. So it started off not that long ago in the late 1990s, really in connection with feminist websites relating to sexual assault. So a number of feminist websites were describing the issue or dealing with the issue of rape or sexual assault, and they would give an announcement at the beginning of the website or at the top of the website, giving a trigger warning that this material may be problematic. And I think it's worth just saying what was meant at that time was the idea that individuals who had previously been sexually assaulted may find that their traumatic response to that assault would be reactivated by the material that they were about to read. Now that then began to broaden out, and it broadened out to material that might reactivate other types of psychological problem. And at that particular point in time, the primary focus was on what are broadly described as being addictive problems. So relating to eating, this was specifically thought about in connection with people who were either struggling with anorexia or had previously been anorexic, and to individuals who have had problems with substance use. It then broadened out further to reactivating any past psychological problem which an individual had and which they were recovering from or had recovered from. And the assumption here was that you're going to be listening or viewing material which could reactivate the problems that you previously had. And then it went further to the idea that the material itself might be traumatizing. So although you might not necessarily have any past history related to problems or related to trauma, the assumption was by listening to or hearing or seeing this material, you might end up being traumatized as a result without any prior history. And then by the mid-2010s, it had expanded even further to basically covering any type of distressing material, which, and I do want to make this clear about what this meant in practice and still tends to mean, which is any material that might make you feel bad. Okay. So that's the way that the whole concept really developed. The interesting thing about this, and I've thought this for quite a long time, was I didn't feel comfortable with this for a couple of reasons. First of all, I wasn't particularly convinced by the argument of it, and I couldn't find any evidence to actually support it. And secondly, I was quite concerned about the broad impact it actually had, particularly on how people saw themselves and how they saw the world that they're a part of. So what's quite interesting is, as I've said, we've had a recent review paper that came out just last year, but actually only really started getting publicity during the first part of this year, which was attempting to address some, I think, pretty important questions about trigger warnings, which was, and these are the four that are stated in the research: do trigger warnings change emotional reactions in response to aversive material, whatever that actually is? Secondly, do trigger warnings increase the avoidance of, warned of material, which is, can I say, at least part of their function? You know, if you remember, the idea behind trigger warnings is that they are designed either to prepare people for what's coming up or alternatively to avoid it. Thirdly, do trigger warnings have any effect on anticipatory emotions before seeing or hearing the material? In other words, do we feel differently, independent of the material? Do we feel differently as a result of actually seeing the trigger warning? And also, not surprisingly, what impact does that then have on our emotional experience of the actual material? And a particular interest, I think, within the educational context is, do trigger warnings in educational context change educational outcomes? For instance, if people are receiving a trigger warning about material, do they actually remember it less? Do they remember it more as a result of the trigger warning? So for those of you that are interested in going into this in a bit further, the Bridgeland, Jones and Ballot paper is the one to actually look at on this. So I'm not going to do a deep dive into the paper itself. I'm just going to share with you what the overall conclusions are actually about this. I think the first thing I want to say is that this is not a single study. It is a review paper. And I'll be saying something in a minute about the size of it, because it is a pretty sizable review. I think also, probably most importantly, it's a very up-to-date review as well. So broadly speaking, these are the findings from the research literature relating to each of these questions. The first thing is, most studies suggest no effect in either enhancing anxiety or reducing anxiety in response to material. Okay, so they make no difference at all to how people actually experience the material, compared, for instance, to people viewing the same material without a trigger warning. They increase avoidance of that material. That was quite clearly one of the aims of putting these in. And this is a really interesting finding, I think. 98% of people do not avoid the material that's being warned of. And the interesting thing about that is that actually it appears to increase engagement in those who are most vulnerable. And by most vulnerable, what's actually meant here is those individuals who have had past experience of that material in their own lives and have had an adverse emotional reaction to it. So it appears that it actually almost has a paradoxical effect. It leads the people who, in a sense, this is set up for, to not actually either prepare themselves or to avoid the material, but instead they're more likely to actually engage in the material as a result of that. Do trigger warnings have any effects on anticipatory emotions? Yes, they do. So the one clear effect that trigger warnings do have is they do make people more anxious prior to seeing the material, following a trigger warning, but it does not affect anxiety during the material. So what actually happens here for the vast majority of people is they will feel worried and anxious in advance of seeing the material, but for the vast majority of people, when they actually see this, that dissipates as soon as they're actually exposed to the material. And do trigger warnings change educational outcomes? Again, there is no evidence of this. They do, however, increase anticipatory anxiety regarding future learning. So they don't seem to affect, which is probably not that surprising, by the way, if these are not, generally speaking, for people having any impact on their engagement with the material. It doesn't actually seem to affect their comprehension of what's being shown in the material. But what it does tend to do is it tends to lead individuals to develop repeated anticipatory anxiety regarding future learning. So in a sense, people become more hypersensitive and hypervigilant about the prospect of threat in future learning situations, but it doesn't seem to make any difference once they're actually engaged in it. So I guess that the broad sort of summary here is that they don't make much difference, but that for some people, they might actually make things worse. And as I said, I wanted to sort of be clear about this because I think what's important to recognize is that although there's an issue around regarding these particular questions, I personally think that the whole issue of trigger warnings has a much broader impact. And I want to particularly raise this because for me, probably it's one of my biggest concerns. And the first concern I have about this, and I'm interested in other people's views on it, is that there does appear to be a convolution of the idea of being traumatized by something and something making us feel bad. And I think that that's a very, in my opinion, a very dubious combination of assumptions. First of all, I think feeling bad periodically is part of human experience and is healthy. Indeed, I will go further than that and be horrified to find myself living in a world where certain material didn't make me feel bad at all, or alternatively, if I thought I was going to feel bad, I would avoid it. Putting it very bluntly, in my opinion, there's certain stuff we need to feel bad about. We need to feel bad about. Secondly, and I think this is really important because I think it has big implications for general psychological health, feeling bad periodically is actually probably the single most common route to resilience. We develop resilience basically by exposing ourselves to challenges and feeling bad very often when we are engaged in those challenges, but through the process of exposing ourselves in this particular way, we develop thicker skins, we become more resilient. I mean, just to give you one simple, obvious example here, if I wanted to learn how to run a marathon, and I've not done any running or much running before, I'm going to need to build that up. And basically, if every time I felt bad after my initial 5-mile run or whatever it was and said, oh, that just shows that this is not good for me, I'm never ever going to build up my resilience. In fact, I'll probably end up becoming more unhealthy as a result. My single biggest concern psychologically is that it develops an intolerance of feeling bad. And that adversely shapes our beliefs about ourselves and also the world around us. It first of all shapes the belief that we have that we are vulnerable. And that for that particular reason, we should be engaging in some form of safe, in inverted commas, which basically means not feeling bad behavior. And it also shapes a view of the world, in my opinion, that there's all of these things out there which are potentially dangerous and which for that particular reason leads us to consider avoidance as being the best thing to be doing. The other difficulty is confusing trauma and feeling bad combined with repeated trigger warnings maintains that anticipatory anxiety, and it inhibits the learning that the material is safe. Now, I was wondering about how to try and communicate this idea briefly because it's quite a complex idea. But let me put it this way. If we are being given repeated messages that certain things are potentially dangerous, we start developing an ongoing belief that things are dangerous. Now, very often when we anticipate something's dangerous, we then experience it, we typically find out it's not as dangerous as we first thought, and we change our beliefs about that particular thing. And that's one of the ways in which our resilience develops. You know, the whole idea that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. But if you've got repeated messages that are occurring, which say that these things are dangerous, we never actually, in a sense, get to have the learning experience that our anticipatory anxiety is incorrect. And so what it actually does is it inhibits our learning process that the material is safe. It's not, in a sense, maybe another useful comparison here would be the comparison with complex trauma, where I haven't yet fully recovered from the first time I'm hit before I'm then hit again. There's not a recovery period. I can't learn anything from it. I can't recover from it. And although that sort of metaphor is not perfect, I hope it gives you some idea of how trigger warnings, in a peculiar way, repeatedly get people ready to be disturbed. And so you develop a belief that things are going to automatically be disturbing. Secondly, and I think this is a really big concern, which we really, I think, as therapists ought to be thinking about quite carefully, which is that trigger warnings increase the approach to distressing material, particularly in the vulnerable. Now, you might at first sight think this is a really weird thing to be doing. But for any of you that have ever done any training with me where we've looked and unpackaged the concept of selective attention, I hope that it will make reasonable sense. So if I am looking out for threat, which is what trigger warnings will encourage me to do, this encourages me to have a hypervigilance for threat and to selectively attend to things that might be perceived as threatening or bad in some particular way. And one of the paradoxical effects of selective attention is that we automatically orientate and move towards the very thing that we selectively attend to, even if we wish to avoid it. And I know that's a strange idea, but we automatically do that. I think it's got a very powerful role to play in all sorts of contexts, of which probably one of them, well, there's a number of them where they're relevant clinically, but I think it's one of the reasons, for instance, that you get recurrent relapse for certain people. It's one of the reasons, for instance, why people who have very negative beliefs about themselves and the world, but whose experience leaves maybe their therapist slightly perplexed about how they've developed that particular belief. And the brief answer is that obviously one of the things that we do when we selectively attend to the things that support our beliefs. But as I'm sure you're aware, if we're worried about something, we see something as threatening, bizarrely, we want to get a closer look. And that's why there's that unfortunate effect that actually occurs. So I actually think, I mean, although this has not been looked at in detail in any of the studies or the review, but although it points in that direction, but I have particular concerns that trigger warnings actually make things worse for the people who are most vulnerable, rather than actually making them better. I think it's really important to just stand back and have a think about why trigger warnings have become so ubiquitous in practically all of the material that we are seeing these days. And I would argue that they're actually a subtle marketing technique in the guise of altruism, and they appeal to what's called safetyism. So again, I can't unpackage this in an enormous detail, but the vast majority of folks who are trying to market something to the general public have a key marketing group that they tend to wish to focus on. And at the moment, as it has been for probably about 50 years, that key group tends to be under 35-year-olds. This is also, incidentally, a particular demographic group that are most easily sold the idea that the world is very dangerous, that they themselves are very vulnerable, and indeed matches up with a lot of personal experience that young people have. I don't have to tell you about the mental health crisis that's around for young people at the moment. And in a sense, what this is doing is that it is rather cynically, in my view, appealing to that particular demographic. But it's presenting it in the form of altruism. Why is it doing this? Because the reality is that there is an enormous danger around that if you are presenting this material repeatedly to people, then you will actually find that people start getting distressed about it. That gets reframed as being traumatized, and it leads to potential legal claims. So we've got a real bizarre irony here, which I'm sure many of you have noticed. I'm not the first person to say this. But if you try and look for dramas, for instance, on TV at the moment, the overwhelming majority of new dramas relate to either violence towards women or police procedurals. And all of that is about saying the world is dangerous and the world does nasty things to people. There's some other effects which I think are very powerful within marketing. Users of trigger warnings know what the market feels or is banned from, and for that reason moves towards it. So there's what's called a Pandora effect here. If you basically say what you're about to see is really not socially desirable, then particularly young people will get drawn to wanting to watch it. And we know that this is the case with all sorts of instances. For instance, if we take an example of where there are no formal trigger warnings, but nonetheless, people will typically know what the material is going to be about. And let me just take an extreme example here, which is self-harming or suicide websites and chat groups. These are things that young people have been told not to look at. So if you advertise something as being something not to look at, what does it do? It basically means that you think to yourself, gosh, what's that secret inside the box? And you're tempted to go and have a look at it. So it's actually very subtle marketing. We also know that any type of product which is sold and is presented as being particularly teasing. Now, teasing, to be honest with you folks, is just another word for emotionally arousing in some particular way. It gives you a taste of something which is going to be more arousing. And we all know, all you have to do, for instance, is to look at any trailer for any film or any program. Do they take the most boring bit? Do they take the most central bit of the program in the teaser? No, they don't. They take the most stimulating part of the drama or the film or whatever. So deliberately designed, again, to actually draw the individuals in whilst presenting themselves as fulfilling an altruistic role to keep people safe. I think from a basic evidence perspective, and from anyone that knows anything about how trauma works and the way in which individuals respond to trauma, they will know that trigger warnings are a very, very uninformed approach to the issue of re-triggering trauma. The first thing to just say is that potential triggers exist everywhere and not just in the selective material. So anyone that's worked with, for instance, with somebody with PTSD will know that the vast majority of triggering events or triggering experiences that might lead people to be re-experiencing the particular trauma have nothing to do with the actual experience itself. They can be sensory triggers. They can be the context in which the person finds themselves. They're in a particular part of town or in a particular room or with a particular group of people. You can get triggering thoughts that go through your head, which can then trigger the trauma. Physical sensations, we know that this applies to in exactly the same way. And it's very common indeed for people who have had a physical sensation during the time of the original trauma, when they have that same sensation for other causes. Very simple example of this, for instance, will be raised heart rate, often find themselves being triggered again. And the same with emotions. And can I just say, you can't warn against them all. Why select some things out and actually create a myth, which is these are the primary things that will create a problem? And at the end of the day, because these triggering things or potentially triggering things are so diverse, really at the end of the day, you're going to either have to warn against everything or not bother at all. The Shantideva quotation here is one that you may well have come across this before from this Buddhist saying, which is, where would I find enough leather to cover the entire surface of the earth? But with leather soles beneath my feet, it's as if the whole world has been covered. In other words, really what we should be doing is helping people to be able to manage and cope with the very wide range of experiences that they might come across, which potentially might lead them to be triggered again. Or this other quotation that I've tended to use quite a lot, which is people drown in swimming pools and die in cars and on bikes. Should we encourage people to avoid pools and driving? No, learn how to cope and use them safely. And I guess that is really what my primary message is with this. One final point to actually make with you folks before I sort of throw this open. Trigger warnings don't even do what they claim to set out to do. I personally, I mean, I could be wrong on this, and maybe you can correct me on this, but I have never seen a single trigger warning that advises or educates on how to cope with the material that the individual's about to see. You know, and the reality is that very often this material is not just occurring on a magazine page or in a TV drama or in a film. It's potentially occurring wherever. You know, if we take violence as one particular example, if I'm a young person who goes out on a Saturday night, the chances are reasonably high at some point I'm going to see violence on the street, which is going to be close to me. Would it not be really useful to help young people to identify how to cope with that material, rather than to encourage them to say, hey, look out, this is dangerous, and actually you might want to avoid it? Thank goodness, all I can say is that they don't work for a lot of people. And the reason why I say this is one of the key, most effective ways of helping people to deal with the effects of traumatic episodes, whether they are single episodes, whether they are complex trauma, is some form of exposure. And that actually helps individuals to more successfully adapt to past trauma. What we are potentially doing here is, if people were to take these seriously in the way in which they've been designed, it would lead people into recurrent avoidance, which we know in so many instances actually compounds problems and maintains them. But over and above this, my biggest concern, as I mentioned to you earlier, is whatever is occurring for the individual, whether it has no effect on them, which it appears to have on the majority of people in terms of what they actually do. What it does do, very broadly, in my opinion, is it strengthens beliefs. It strengthens cultural beliefs, which basically say, I am personally vulnerable and all sorts of things could potentially damage me, so please don't expose me to them. And also a general perception that the world is unsafe and should be avoided. We already know the impact that, for example, the pandemic had on social withdrawal and the subsequent problems, particularly young people have had as a result of going through such a long period of avoidance. This potentially just continues the problem. So folks, I am interested in your thoughts on this. I'm interested in whether you agree or disagree. I'm interested in your ideas about how to approach it or how to change it. So I'll pass things over to Julia, and Julia, feel free to, I don't know if there's any questions that have come up in the chat box, and also whether people want to ask them themselves.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you. It was interesting and definitely thought-provoking. Before I open the floor to the participants, I just wanted to mention that the recordings of all our SDS Thursdays are available on our YouTube channel, and I will show you quickly, and you will not only see the presenter, Paul presenting, or other presenters presenting, you will see all the slides. So if you want to go through the particular slides or look up the research Paul mentioned, please refer to our YouTube channel. All SDS Thursdays are available there. And of course, I will ask you to subscribe and probably leave a like or leave a comment. But for now, there were not many comments, but I will very much invite you to either write a comment in the chat box, or if you want to comment verbally, please just make yourself known and unmute yourself and say a few words. I can see a comment here from Karen. Very thought-provoking. How would you approach the topic with a young person suffering from generalized anxiety disorder, for example?
Okay. When you say approach the topic, so I would start off from the assumption that the young person that is, and for people who are not familiar with the term generalized anxiety disorder, you can simply reframe this as chronic excessive worry. I would be really surprised if this was the only stimulus material that created worry. So in a sense, you know, this would basically be saying, I think for people who chronically worry, is this the only thing that you worry about? Probably not. And yet, whatever it is that you're currently doing, does it make a difference that the vast majority of things you're confronted by don't have trigger warnings? Actually, do you feel more anxious about these particular things, which do have trigger warnings? Is that helpful to feel even more anxious or not? And I think as well, I will be always interested to come back to the point that I made earlier on, which is that how more vulnerable people appear to move towards material that actually has trigger warnings. So my first thing is to actually ask the young person, do you then choose to turn over or to go to something else? And if they say, well, no, you know, this is very similar, folks, isn't it, to when you go and see a horror film, and although it's horrifying, you can't tear your eyes away from the screen. You know, that's the power of selective attention. So I would want to broaden it out, really, and really just raise the question of, would you like to be able to deal with all the different things that you find yourself worrying about, and would you like to know how to address that, rather than seeing trigger warnings as somehow or other reducing the risk, which they, I suspect, don't actually do for people. Yeah.
Thank you. Monica has her hand up. Please unmute yourself, Monica, and go ahead.
Oh, yes. Okay. It's a question. Quick questions about a client I had suffering from PTSD, a traumatic event, and this individual was raped, basically, and the triggers were basically that changed. That changed her perception of danger. She had the tendency of generalize to the colleagues of mine are dangerous, so I won't go to parties, which she had to go because she was senior. So social occasions were very part of her job, really. But she had this, she felt really uncomfortable with that because of this perception of that everybody was dangerous, men were dangerous, and tried to harass her. Also, and then it was a discussion with her about how dangerous, she was very hyper vigilant. So how dangerous it is to walk at night, and so it was a challenge to try to make her like a resilient about this. How would you respond to that?
Okay, well, a couple of things to say, really. If we keep, first of all, with the trigger warning element of it, would it be useful for all social events to subsequently have a prior notice which says, men might actually be here, so please be warned? And I hope you can immediately see how that actually could make things worse. and also it is not a particularly helpful thing to do. So that's the trigger warning bit of it. I think that undoubtedly, I mean, the way in which I would approach this, and I do appreciate people approach it in different ways, is I would start off with some of her most central belief, which is something along the lines of all men are dangerous. And I will be interested to identify what predictions she makes off the back of that. Because in a sense, it's not just about the fact that she sees the world or men as dangerous that's the primary problem. It's about the prediction that she makes about what will happen should she have contact with such people, if that makes sense. So that's what I would be wanting to focus on is the predictions of it. And there's a number of ways of addressing that. We could, I would be approaching it from a cognitive perspective primarily. So I would want to set up behavioral experiment on this, basically to help the person discover whether that particular prediction is true or not, but doing it obviously in a way which is acceptable to the client. And the aim here is not to scare people to death, obviously, but there are ways in which that can actually be set up. So I want to do that. I think almost inevitably, for the person to be able to discover the truth of that particular prediction, they will have to actually engage slowly, maybe with support, into some form of exposure. The problem is that avoidance, which is obviously her understandable and natural response to this, actually unfortunately helps to maintain her negative belief that the world is dangerous. Because, you know, if you were to say to her, well, is it the case that actually anything has actually happened since? She would say, well, no, of course it hasn't, but that's because I always keep myself to myself and don't go to such things. So in a peculiar way, the ongoing avoidance keeps that belief forever strong. So there's going to have to be some degree of supportive movement towards some slow degree of exposure. So those, I mean, there's a large amount of other stuff that would need to be done with that, but those would be two things that I probably would want to incorporate into any work that I did with that.
I just wanted to add that we have courses on PTSD and CBT for PTSD, and they are available as recordings. So have a look at those. And we also have a recorded course on behavioral experiments, specifically how to set up a behavioral experiment with your client. There's a few really, really good and interesting comments. For example, this one is from Rob. I'm so pleased that I attended today, as I fully agree with everything that Paul has said. I'm dealing with an issue where trigger warnings are being used to infantilize the staff, including trigger warnings at the start of an email. It's just a question of how far are we ready to go with this?
This is the problem with broadening this out. You know, it has, because as I said, I've had experiences of people having conversations with me in the pub and saying, you know, before I say this, I really need to give you a trigger warning that it's going to be about X. But can you see the set of cultural beliefs that this creates? I used to do some work, particularly on resilience with young children. And one of the metaphors I often took with young kids is that if you want to play in the playground, you've got to learn to be able to scrape your knees. That's part and parcel of, I would say, learning to live life. You don't want your legs totally broken. Of course you don't. But actually feeling mildly uncomfortable is part and parcel of the experience and enjoyment of life. And to try and create an environment where everybody is never put into contact with this, I don't just think doesn't work. I think it creates a mythology, which is that actually to have the healthiest life is a life of withdrawal. And I fundamentally disagree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, Stephanie's comment. Do you think people are being categorized too easily and are internalizing their condition so that it becomes the inherent part of them?
Well, the brief answer to that is yes. That's a whole nother topic to be opened up. But I think that it is certainly much more common for young people to use a mental health diagnosis as an integral part of their identity in a way now than it was the case even 10 years ago. I think probably,
yeah.
sorry?
It wasn't the case 10 years ago.
Yes, it wasn't the case. I mean, I think for me, the big changing point was sitting on a train with I could hear a conversation occurring between two young people behind me where they were talking about a classmate and trying to decide between the two of them whether the person had borderline personality disorder or was bipolar. And I was just absolutely fascinated because you're listening to this conversation, you're trying to work out the age that these young people are. And I only found out because my back was to them when they actually got off the train. They looked to me about 13 or 14. And to start defining identity in this way so universally is exceptionally unhelpful. And there's a whole range of reasons for it. And can I just make it very, very clear indeed, I'm not trying to underestimate the degree of psychological distress that young people are experiencing and its growth. And there's a whole range of reasons for that. But I actually think that diagnostically categorizing experience in this way actually feeds into making it worse. And I've seen so many examples, again, particularly in young people, although I do see it in adults, where they receive a diagnosis and, surprise, surprise, they selectively attend to anything that supports that diagnosis. So they will say, well, no wonder I do X because of, and they will present that particular diagnosis, and it occurs with adults as well. So yes, I do have big concerns about it. I do have big concerns about it.
Yeah. There's a few quite excellent comments. They're quite long, and I'm just aware of the time. So, Paul, in your opinion, you put a question into the title of this presentation: should trigger warnings be abolished? What do you think?
Yeah, undoubtedly, if anyone was in any doubt. You know, I mean, I could sit here and say, well, yeah, abolish them because they're a waste of time. And I think that in the vast majority of instances, for individuals, they are a waste of time. But as I've already emphasized, when we move away from the impact that it has on individuals, I actually do think it has an adverse effect on general cultural beliefs within our society about ourselves and perceiving ourselves as vulnerable. And in addition to that, perceiving the world out there as basically being something that's not survivable and should be avoided at all costs. And I find that very, very worrying. Yes. So yes, I think it should be banned, at least as a first step. Yeah.
I want to finish with a comment from Rupert, which I think is a fantastic comment to finish our presentation. Rupert says, in some American universities, the phrase trigger warning is now deemed triggering and has had to be reframed.
I have heard that, in fact. Yeah, and actually the interesting thing about that is that there is some truth in that. Because one thing we do actually know is it does increase anticipatory anxiety. So yes, if I'm going to go along to something and there's a trigger warning, yes, it does make me more anxious before it starts. It doesn't affect my experience of the material, but it certainly leads me to think, wow, I'm in this environment where there's all these dangerous things, and that makes me more anxious. Can I just make one final point before we finish? Because I said, you know, how this term has been extended and extended and extended. Can I just point out where it's not being extended? It's not being extended, generally speaking, to eating, and it's not being generally extended, particularly to alcohol. Why is that random decision made? Why is that random decision made? And you know, and there is easily as strong an argument to be made that if I'm someone who's had an alcohol problem and no longer have, it may well be distressing. But if you were to actually talk to people who have got a past problem with alcohol and say, does that mean that you have to, you know, avoid watching such programs? The vast majority of them will actually say, you can't shut yourself away. You know, I won't watch programs where people get seriously drunk, but I know that by reading the content of the program in advance. But anything apart from that, no, you can't protect yourself. The reality is that, well, you have to put leather on your feet rather than trying to cover the whole world in leather.
So in the last 1 minute of our meeting today, I will ask you to write down, because we need to do something about it. So if you just write down, what do you think? Should trigger warnings be abolished, yes or no? And because we will have it on YouTube and without your names, of course, but at least we will be able to have some sort of conclusion of this group of mental health professionals and what they believe on this particular topic. So as always, just spend a few seconds to write your opinion in the chat box, please. And after that, you can unmute yourself and say your goodbyes, and we will see you on the 6th of June, which will be a very unusual presentation, and I won't tell you much about it beforehand, but you can always go on our website and see in SDS News what will be happening on the 6th of June. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Take care, folks.
so
Look
much.
after yourselves.
Really good as
Take care.
always.
Take care.
Bye.
Look after
Thank
yourselves.
you.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye. Fantastic to see you all. Thank
Bye.
you.
It's good to see you all. Yeah, definitely. Yes. Take care, folks.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.